Hey guys, this is Mr. Breen, and in this video I'll be talking about fiscal policy. Now the word fiscal here comes from the Latin for a word, meaning a money bag, a money bag. Okay, so this really has to do with the government's budget, both income and expenses. In fiscal policy, we're really only talking about two tools, taxes and spending. And by spending, I mean government spending. And this is pretty simple. You have a dial, right? Basically, you can imagine it this way. And there's, it's like your stove top at home. There's high and low, and you can move this dial between high and low. You can say, well, we'll have low taxes and low spending. Or you can say high taxes and high spending, or high taxes and low spending, or high spending and low taxes. So who's in charge of fiscal policy, right? Not you and not me and not economists sitting in offices at their universities. Instead, it is Congress and the president. This should be fairly obvious. Well, who passes tax laws and who passes spending bills, right? Spending laws. Well, it's Congress. And who signs them? It's the president. Okay. Whenever somebody tells me, oh yeah, fiscal policy, that's the central bank is in charge of that. Well, we fought a whole Revolutionary War, right, where we said no taxation without representation. And so when you tell me that the Federal Reserve can raise taxes, it just confuses me. It makes me think you don't really sort of know your history very well. Here's the other thing that people are constantly saying that, is sort of true. They say, well, who's in charge of fiscal policy? Well, the government is in charge of fiscal policy. Okay, that's not good enough for you to say that because, the guy at the Secretary of State's office down the road, he doesn't have anything to do with fiscal policy, but he works for the government, right? And the Supreme Court is part of the government, but they don't really control fiscal policy at all. So this is a little bit too vague, too general. Okay, you must tell me, when you tell me who's in charge of fiscal policy, you have to say Congress and the president, right? We have a separation of powers that gives certain powers to Congress and the president that other people in the government don't get. Okay, so there are two kinds of policy when it comes to fiscal policy. There are expansionary policies. For example, high government spending, and low taxes, more money in people's pockets. Okay. And then there's contractionary policy, which means quite the opposite, low spending, and high taxes, take money out of people's pockets. So expansionary policy must be what you do when there's, and let me draw a business cycle here, GDP and time. And here's our cycle. It goes up and down and up and down, whatever. So expansionary policy must be what we do when we're in an expansion, right? No, right? The whole point of expansionary policy is that we cause the GDP, to expand more than it otherwise would. So we don't want to do it when there's already an upturn, because that could cause lots of inflation. Okay, instead, we're going to do it when there's a downturn in the economy in order to cause that downturn to be smaller. Let's see. So instead of a big downturn like that, maybe it's a shallow downturn like that, and fewer people become unemployed. The same thing goes for contractionary policy. It's not the kind of policy you initiate when you're in a contraction. Instead, it's the kind of policy that you have when you want to slow down a bit of economic growth. So here, this is good economic growth, right? GDP is going up a lot. That's good. But what's a side effect of economic growth? Oftentimes, inflation, because sometimes that economic growth is an increase in aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand is going up, okay, then you're going to get some inflation. Well, too much, a little inflation is fine, right? 3% inflation, that's okay. But if it starts getting up in the maybe 7, 8, 10% range, that's excessive. We don't want that. That causes instability. So instead, we want to just make this upturn a little more gradual. In other words, with either of these kinds of policies, you want stability, along with your steady growth. So what do expansionary policies fight? Well, they fight unemployment. What do contractionary policies fight? They fight inflation. This contractionary policy bit can often be confusing to students, especially students who think that inflation happens when there's a recession, which usually doesn't happen. Okay, but they just think, why would you ever want to slow down economic growth? Well, that's because economic growth often comes accompanied with inflation. The contractionary policies aren't designed to slow down growth, right? So much as they are designed to slow down inflation. Okay, this means timing is very important in this kind of policy. So again, with our business cycle, okay, there's GDP over time. And you might have, here's a standard business cycle without the government being involved. Okay, so if you get the timing right, maybe instead you can get it to look a little more like this. Okay, you ended up in the same place, but a little more gradually. And if you get the timing wrong, so let's say here the economy is growing just fine, but you, for whatever reason, you initiated some expansionary policy that was not well timed, and instead you got a bunch of growth which came with inflation. And then you were so worried about that just when the economy was about to go down on its own, you passed contractionary policy. And so contractionary policy, coinciding with the natural drop in the economy, causes a massive downturn, followed by another ill-timed expansionary policy, big upswing, ill-timed contractionary policy, big downswing, big upswing. Maybe you end up at the same point you were going to before, but you had massive inflation, big unemployment, massive inflation, big unemployment, massive inflation. Okay, nobody wants that kind of instability. That could actually harm you in the long term. So good timing is absolutely crucial. But there are a few problems with fiscal policy, one of which is that the solution to economic downturns is spending a bunch of money and lowering taxes, which leads to potentially to a lot of debt. And if you have a lot of debt, that might actually prevent you from being able to do effective fiscal policy in the future. Okay. It's also hard to make predictions about the business cycle, right? Nobody knows exactly when a downturn is going to happen or when the economy is going to begin recovery. I mean, sometimes you can sort of say generally speaking, but it's not always the easiest thing in the world to predict. And because timing is so important, if your prediction is wrong, that could have severe consequences. Okay, there are also political disagreements, right? Since it's in the hands of Congress and the president, well, the business cycle isn't always, it is often a high priority, but it isn't always their very first one, right? And they might, will say, well, we'll agree to your well-timed fiscal stimulus, but only if you agree to some other things, and maybe they can't find agreement on that. Okay, there could also be corruption in this whole process. So part of this whole thing is having high government spending. Well, what are we going to spend more money on? Maybe a high-ranking congressman has a friend in a certain industry who starts to get some very favorable contracts for things the government wants to spend money on. How did that happen, right? So corruption can also make this process either less effective or just in general bad. And then also you have to coordinate state and federal policy, which is hard. Because states can do fiscal policy, right? They have a Congress and they have an administrator called a governor, and they raise taxes and they spend money, so they can also do fiscal policy, right? But because most states, every state except Vermont, must have a balanced budget every year, okay, states have a really hard time enacting expansionary policy because, when there's a downturn in the economy, their tax revenues go down. And so they can't spend more money. In fact, they often spend less. And so the federal government not only has to step in with the normal policy they would have to have anyway, but sometimes with fiscal policy that is so big or big enough to override the fact that states are doing the opposite of what economists might want them to do.